Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Zoom presentation sponsored by Tokyo Jolt. I'm Heather, I'm the president of the chapter, and we are thrilled to have you with us tonight. Our presenter this evening is Davey Young, Dr. Davey Young. He's a lecturer at English Studies at Sophia University with an MA in TESOL and PhD in International Studies. Dr. Young is also the co-editor of Barrier-Free Instruction in Japan, Recommendations for Teachers at All Levels of Schooling, and his research focuses on inclusive language education and equipping teachers to support students with disabilities. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's get started.
Beautiful. Thank you, Heather, for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen now and get this slideshow going. Okay, here we go. So yeah, I guess I'll just jump right in. Thank you, Heather, for the excellent introduction. I don't think I have anything more to say about that. Also, I think I know about 80% of the audience, so everybody knows me already. So today I'm going to be talking about research that I did recently for my dissertation, which I finished earlier this year, which was focused on English language teachers' capacity for inclusive teaching using Japanese post-secondary settings as a case context. And so I'm just going to be sharing sort of the main findings from that research. For our plan for the night, I'm going to go through quickly a brief literature review. Oh, sorry, there's a typo. I just am seeing in not review. I'm going to give a brief literature review. Sorry for not catching that earlier. And then I'll move on to my research question, design, and methodology. I'll spend most of my time then on the findings and discussion, ending with a summary discussion of the implications and limitations, and finally connecting my findings back to some complicating factors in implementing inclusive education worldwide. Please don't be intimidated by the number of slides here. They should go pretty quickly, especially a lot of the slides in the findings and discussion section when I'm just kind of sharing some quick statistics. And I hope to finish up in about 45 minutes or so we have some time for discussion and Q&A at the end. Okay, so jumping in, the first thing I want to do is give this definition of inclusive education. So if we're talking about inclusive education, language teachers or any set of teachers' capacity for implementing inclusive education, we need to know what we mean by this term. Because the fact of the matter is this term is a little bit difficult to define, and people have different definitions of inclusive education. And we need to sort of know exactly what we mean when we use this term throughout a discourse like this. So this definition that I'm using is from the United Nations. It's specifically from General Comment number 4 to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which that amendment to that original policy document is from 2016. And this definition is important for a couple of reasons. One, it is regarded, so the GC4, this definition, the GC4, and the GC4's guidance on inclusive education is generally regarded as the best and most comprehensive policy guidance on inclusive education that we have in the world. And so this is what most sort of policymakers at national levels and what many researchers use. And another reason that I'm using this definition is that it's multifaceted. So we don't need to read through and understand every single word that's on the screen here, but just I want to point out that there's sort of 4 dimensions to this definition, and we need to understand what each one of them is just basically. So first of all, inclusive education is to be understood as a fundamental human right of all learners. So this is inclusive education, most broadly speaking. It simply means education for all. And now inclusive education as a field developed as an alternative to special education. And so a lot of inclusive education is concerned with education for students with disabilities. However, the remit for inclusive education has since been broadened to include education for all learners, so it concerns itself with other minoritized groups, but it's still very much rooted in concern for students with disabilities. And my research is focused on teachers of students with disabilities. In addition to being a human right for all learners, inclusive education is a means of realizing other human rights. It's a form of empowerment, right? Education it leads to social empowerment. And it is also a principle that values the well-being of all students and the result of a process of continuing and proactive commitment to eliminate barriers. So this is the working definition that we'll be using tonight. And I also kind of introduced this specific policy definition, again, from the General Comment number 4 to the CRPD, because we're going to come back at the very end the sort of considerations that I'll make at the end of this presentation also connect back to a separate part of the same policy document. So you can maybe bear that in mind. Okay, it's also important to understand that inclusive education needs to be adapted for each context in which it is implemented. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to inclusive education. Different countries, different levels of education, different groups of students, different schooling environments all require different, there are different considerations to be made anytime inclusive education is applied. And this is also field specific. So a field like language learning or English language learning also requires specific consideration. There are certain considerations that need to be made for how we implement inclusive education. So a couple of core considerations that we need to make. We need to first of all understand that students with disabilities, and in particular those with specific learning difficulties, such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD, experience unique cognitive and affective challenges to language learning compared to learning other subjects, as well as compared to learning for students or peers without disabilities. Of course, other forms of or other impairments also present, or language learning can present barriers to students with other forms of impairments, but in particular for students with specific learning difficulties. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that English language teachers compared to, say, a math teacher or a history teacher, what have you, English language teachers may be more inclusively minded than other field-specific teachers due to our sensitivity to linguistic diversity. So there's an argument to be made that because we are used to teaching students from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, we're more sensitive to other forms of difference. And I think there's something to that. However, many English language teachers lack training, familiarity, self-efficacy implementing inclusive approaches to teaching. So these are a few kind of, specific considerations that we need to make when we talk about implementing inclusive education for language teaching. In addition, there have been a number of concerns about teaching students with disabilities reported by English language teachers in a variety of different studies. These include, I'm going to show you 2 slides here with, I think, 8 or 9, I guess 8 concerns total, in sort of descending order from how frequently they've been reported in studies. And some of these studies are really large scale. The first 2, or the first 3 actually in this list of citations, the Ali, Fernandez, Portero, and Hale and Ono are large surveys. And then a lot of smaller scale studies, qualitative studies have also found these concerns. Most commonly reported among these is lack of training, followed by low confidence and self-efficacy teaching inclusively, increased workload, giving appropriate attention due to class size, and followed by uncertainty about diagnoses and disclosure, differentiating and difficulty with language learning, student performance, and acceptance by peers. Now, all of these things are important for us to consider, or in other words, it's important for us to consider teachers' concerns, teachers' thoughts on inclusive education, because teachers' views on inclusive education influence and impact inclusion in actual practice. Teachers who have a more developed understanding of inclusive education have more positive views and perceive themselves to be more prepared to implement inclusive practices. And understanding of inclusive education can be achieved in both pre-service training and in-service interventions, or in other words, ongoing professional development. Both forms of training and preparation can affect teachers' views of and self-efficacy implementing inclusive practices. Now, one of the most common instruments used to investigate teachers' views of inclusion is called the Sentiments, Attitudes, and Concerns about Inclusive Education Scale, which was created by a group of authors, Forlin et al. And it improved upon a previous scale, which didn't have the revised name, and that original scale pulled together 3 pre-existing scales that were widely used in the preceding couple of decades. And this instrument now has been used in dozens of studies in various contexts, from elementary through post-secondary contexts around the world, translated into different languages. So very commonly used. And it measures the 3 psychometric constructs listed in its name: sentiments, attitudes, and concerns. And the creators of this scale argue that these constructs are central to the rationale underlying a teacher's beliefs and support for and engagement with inclusive practices. So let's get a quick definition of these three constructs because we're going to see them again. Not to spoil the surprise, but this is the instrument that I used in the research that I'm reporting. So sentiments are sentiments about engaging people with disabilities. Attitudes refers to acceptance of learners with different support needs. And concerns are concerns about inclusive education. So just if you want to kind of, quickly jot those down because we'll see these terms again and again, but, I'll remind you of the key points as we go. Okay, now, as I said, this scale has been used dozens of times in many different contexts, and across all of these various studies, several factors have been found to correlate with or predict these three concepts of sentiments, attitudes, and concerns. The most common among them are confidence in students with disabilities, experience teaching students with disabilities, previous interaction with people with disabilities, inclusive practices, self-efficacy, knowledge of local policy, and teacher training in inclusive practices. So in other words, as all of these background factors go up, then people's responses, people's sentiments, attitudes, and concerns also go up, or their concerns, diminish. However, no large-scale investigation into English language teachers' attitudes about inclusive education had been conducted. And so that led me to my research question, which was, what are English language teachers' sentiments, attitudes, and concerns about students with disabilities and inclusive education, and what factors may influence them? And so that's what I'll be reporting on today. And so I adopted a mixed methods approach to maximize the strengths and minimize the weaknesses of a strictly quantitative approach. Specifically, I used a concurrent triangulation method so that the qualitative stage could confirm and cross-validate the findings from the quantitative stage. And so in other words, this was a two-stage. I had a quantitative stage that was conducted first, a qualitative stage that was conducted second to validate the findings from the first stage. And so I'll describe these briefly now. So stage one was the quantitative stage. This was a modified version of the Saussure. And this specific instrument, there are other instruments I could have used, but I chose this one after a review of the available instruments for its common use. As I said, it's been used really widely. So I had a good, foundation. I had lots of other studies I could kind of draw from and compare to. It has established reliability, contextual sensitivity, and flexibility, which was very important because I needed to revise all 5 of the items on the attitude subscale to suit language learning contexts. Because if a language teacher saw the original 5 items, they wouldn't really make much sense. And I won't go into detail why now because of time constraints, but it was suitable for my purposes. I then piloted the survey. I piloted this modified version to confirm item phrasing of those new 5 items in the attitude subscale. And then I set about getting my full respondents. And so I ended up collecting 239 usable responses through convenience and snowball sampling. And the final item on the survey recruited stage 2 participants, basically asked people to volunteer for stage 2. And I ended up having more than 13, but I ended up having 13 people in stage 2. Stage 2, the qualitative stage, was a combination of observational and interview data. So I conducted classroom observations and followed those up with post-observation interviews, followed incident technique. So the lesson observation was the sort of central incident or the central episode. Comprised of these different critical incidents, and then teachers were invited to reflect on those critical incidents from the lesson observation. And that's how we sort of picked apart the inclusive character of these lessons. In the lesson observations, I used a novel instrument created specifically for this research called the Inclusive Practices in English Language Teaching Observation Scale. I inventoried 40 inclusive behaviors by conducting, a review of pertinent literature. And then these 40 inclusive behaviors, as I'm, watching the lesson, I have my iPelt and I'm basically scoring the performance of these 40 behaviors using magnitude coding. And I'll show you the kind of key magnitude code later on. And these 40 inclusive behaviors were also grouped into 10 pedagogical domains for easier analysis, and we'll see those domains later on. After the interview, or excuse me, after the observation, I conducted a post-observation interview for each participant. And then that interview data was, of course, audio recorded, transcribed, and then thematically analyzed using the constant comparative method. For first cycle coding, I used a combination of structural and provisional coding, supplemented by in vivo coding for emergent themes. And then second cycle coding was axial coding to facilitate relational analysis and revise initial codes. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, postsecondary Japan was selected as a case context. As I also mentioned earlier, the implementation of inclusive education must be adapted to its target context. So I needed a narrow focus. And local factors such as the level of education being taught, so postsecondary education in this context, policy awareness, end policy awareness as examples of local factors affect the perception and enactment of inclusive education. And also SACIR results can vary from country to country based on local factors such as teacher training and personal beliefs. So I needed to have a narrow context. I couldn't just, spam Facebook and get English language teachers from around the world. I needed one specific setting. And I selected post-secondary Japan very simply because it is the context in which I work. And so I have, personal involvement in seeing or gaining a better understanding of this landscape and seeing it improve. And I also had just easier access to data. It was easier for me to get participants because this is the context in which I'm working. Okay, so jumping to the results, I'll go through just very quickly some background variables. As you can see here, I had a variety of, or diversity of respondents in terms of their age, gender, and nationality. Slightly more men, or I guess not slightly, but more men than women. I had predominantly more Americans than any other nationality group, followed by people from the UK and Japan, and kind of spread across the gamut on age. This is just for context. As it turns out, none of these factors ended up predicting sentiments or attitudes or concerns, regardless of teachers' nationality, gender, or age. That did not influence their views, but just for context. Also for context, and actually these did influence these constructs. Qualifications, there were qualifications held. Of course, these teachers could hold multiple qualifications. The most commonly held qualification, as you can see in the second line, was an MA in TESOL or similar, with 54% of respondents holding this qualification. Very interestingly, I mean, this is just a simple descriptive statistic, no analysis involved here at all, but I still think this is one of the most significant findings from this survey. The very bottom line, you can see that nearly 85% of these respondents reported not receiving training to teach students with disabilities when receiving any of the listed qualifications, which to me is just really significant because it adds to this body of research that says language teachers have not been trained to teach students with disabilities. However, I did have more than half of the respondents reported receiving in-service training. So about 55% reported some form of ongoing professional development aimed at teaching students with disabilities, with the most prevalent being doing independent reading or research. And then 45.2% or 108 respondents reported not receiving any such training. All right, now here are the descriptive results of the scale itself. So this is the SACIR, and these attitudes items in the middle are the revised items. And you can see just from the means on the right that the sentiments and attitudes were fairly high, but the concerns were a bit more neutral. A couple things to point out. We won't go through every single item here, and I'll show you the averages very quickly there, the mean scores for the total subscales. I'll show that again in a moment. But one thing just to mention is at the very bottom, you can see concerns items 4 and 5. So at the bottom of the table here. I am concerned that students with disabilities will not be accepted by the rest of the class, and I'm concerned that I do not have knowledge and skills required to teach students with disabilities. So the bottom one was the largest concern. These items were reverse coded, and so that low score of 2.11 on the 5-point Likert scale, that average of 2.11 actually means that it's reverse coded. So most people agreed with that statement, and then it was reverse coded, so it's low. But concerns items 4 and 5 were ultimately removed from the scale to improve goodness of fit. And I'll mention that again later, but just keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, the internal reliability for each subscale was deemed to be sufficient. For sentiments and concerns, these alpha values are a little bit, are slightly below the average alpha values of all the different studies I could find that use the same survey, the same scale. The attitude subscale is higher than average, but again, it is modified. It's a completely different attitude subscale. Not completely different, but it's modified from the original version. And again, the mean values for sentiments and attitudes, they're well above or significantly above the midpoint of that 5-point Likert scale, and concerns is closer to the midpoint. So we could say that these teachers had positive sentiments and attitudes, and they were somewhat neutral on their concerns about implementing inclusive education. Next, I conducted a correlation analysis between some other different variables, ordinal variables. And so you can see, I've just highlighted the kind of important points here. We can see here that there are statistically significant correlations between these three subscales of sentiments, attitudes, and concerns, and these different background factors being interaction, previous interactions with people with disabilities, knowledge of local legislation, knowledge of global policy, experience teaching students with disabilities, confidence teaching students with disabilities, and inclusive practices, self-efficacy. So there's a correlation between all of these things. Which is not really surprising. What did surprise me a little bit was that when I conducted the factor analysis, so for these variables, I conducted a robust multilinear regression, and most of them did not predict the factors at all. But some of the other background variables did. So I'll get to that next. So some factors predicted sentiments. And again, remember, sentiments is sentiments about engaging people with disabilities. And the two things that I really want to highlight here, we don't need to read through every line, but the important thing to pull out here is these two boxes. So the first box, the orange box, these are two forms of pre-service training. In the blue box, we have three forms of in-service training. And so among these are the only factors that predicted sentiments. All the other factors, so for example, knowledge of legislation, for example, did not predict. Gender, nationality, age group did not predict, but did. And the same thing with attitudes. When we get to attitudes about accommodating students' different support needs, we have teachers who received training to teach students with disabilities while receiving an MA in TESOL or a PhD in TESOL by linguistics or similar, and teachers who receive training to teach students with disabilities by attending conference presentations or doing independent reading or research, they had better attitudes. And many groups had fewer concerns, all based on training. 3 different pre-service training groups and 3 different in-service training groups. These groups of teachers had fewer concerns. They were less concerned about implementing inclusive education as a result of this training. One group, interestingly, had more concerns. Holders of an MA TESOL applied linguistics or similar were more concerned about implementing inclusive education than people who did not hold an MA in TESOL applied linguistics or similar. And when we compare that with the finding here that the top line, receiving training to teach students with disabilities while receiving an MA in TESOL applied linguistics or similar, those 13 teachers, they had fewer concerns. Whereas if you had an MA but didn't receive the training, you had much more concerns. So this just highlights this gap, right? Basically, if people are receiving an MA in TESOL applied linguistics or similar and are not receiving training to teach students with disabilities, they're still learning enough to realize, hey, something's going on here. Maybe I should have some kind of training, right? Maybe I should be concerned. They're learning enough to be concerned. They're not learning enough to overcome those concerns and actually implement inclusive education. So this lends support to one of my conclusions, which is that we need to do a better job of training pre-service teachers and teaching students with disabilities. Okay, so that's the quantitative findings. And now to move on to stage 2, which again was the lesson observations and post-observation interviews. So I had 13 teachers from 13 of the survey respondents who were able to participate in stage 2. These participants were generally more positive than the larger group. We can see there this subset's mean scores for sentiments, attitudes. Oh gosh, there's another typo. Oh, there's 2 typos in attitudes. I'm sorry. They had better attitudes, sentiments, attitudes, and concerns compared to the larger group. And I think this is a result of selection bias, essentially. The teachers who took the survey and were willing to volunteer and have a researcher come into their classroom and scrutinize their capacity for inclusive teaching, they felt more comfortable doing that. So I think it's not surprising that we would have this difference here. But keep that in mind as I share the results with you. These teachers came there from 11 different institutions from across Japan. There were a variety of private and public university teachers, mostly private, 10 foreign nationals, and 3 Japanese citizens, 3 Japanese nationals. And I want to focus on a couple of the findings from the qualitative stage. And the first of that is concerns. So one of the big things I wanted to know, of course, I wanted to know and validate the findings from that survey. So I wanted to know more about sentiments, attitudes, and concerns. And I conducted analysis for all 3 of those subscales, but I'm going to focus tonight on concerns because I think this is kind of the most significant for it's the most useful data, I think. If we know what teachers' concerns are about inclusive education, that's something that we can address. So through the post-observation interviews, I asked teachers, I was inviting the participants to talk about their teaching and reflect on the lesson. And as they're telling me about the lesson or reflecting on something that they did or their teaching context, concerns about teaching inclusively would be voiced indirectly, and those would be, identified, thematically coded. And then I did ask explicitly, I asked every participant, what are your concerns about teaching students with disabilities? And they had a chance to answer that up front. And so this is a combination of those direct and indirect concerns. And I labeled the participants A through M to preserve anonymity, so you can see them across the top, and you can see which participants raised which concerns. And then at the end, there's a tally of the total times these concerns were raised. And so, for example, we can see here at the end of the last, almost last column here, at the top row, diagnosis and/or disclosure. Participant M raised this specific concern at 4 different times during the interview. And so the total tally, we have 2 concerns jump out. They're sort of a tier above the others. There's a big gap after the second one in terms of how frequently these concerns were raised. Concerns about diagnosis and/or disclosure of students with disabilities and curricular constraints were raised the most frequently. So I'm going to focus on those in my discussion tonight with some additional discussion for institutional barriers, because as I will show, the concerns for diagnosis and/or disclosure and concern for curricular constraints were very frequently connected to a concern about institutional barriers to inclusion. So first, let's talk about concern for issues related to diagnosis and/or disclosure of disability. This was expressed 29 times by 10 participants, and this concern has been previously noted by English language teachers, including in post-secondary contexts. So the first and third of those 2 citations there were also conducted in post-secondary Japanese context. So it's a common concern, in this context. And this likely results in large part, I would say, or argue, from the policy of selective inclusion at the post-secondary level. And this policy of selective inclusion is it's a legal guarantee. Students with disabilities in universities have a right to autonomy, and they choose to disclose their disability or remain anonymous. And so I know that many of you in the audience are teaching in the same setting as I am or same context. And we've all sort of been in this situation before. Sometimes we might receive an accommodations letter. Sometimes we might suspect a student in our class might have a specific learning difficulty, but we're not sure. And this results from this policy because students can choose to disclose or they can choose to remain anonymous. And this was also, as I mentioned, frequently connected to a perceived lack of institutional guidance on supporting students with disabilities, which I'll talk about in a moment. First, I want to mention curricular constraints. This concern was raised 27 times by 9 participants, and previous studies have found that curricular constraints can limit adaptation of teaching material for English language learners with dyslexia and visual impairments, and I would argue certainly other students with other impairments as well. Most mentions of this concern were indirect. 20 of these 27 mentions were indirect, which in other words, they were voiced in connection to a specific teaching behavior during the lesson observation, especially those related to differentiation and assessment. So this concern wasn't raised directly very much. If I asked a teacher, what are you concerned about when teaching students with disabilities? Most people didn't say curricular constraints, but they did raise it indirectly. If they were talking about something that they did or tried to do that it would be more inclusive, they would tell me, oh, but I can't because of my curricular constraints, right? I have this mandated curriculum and I can't make this accommodation. That was a common way of voicing this concern. Participants often felt that they lacked the freedom or authority to make changes to the curriculum. Conversely, participants with a higher degree of control over their course content and curriculum expressed smaller concern. And this was also frequently tied to institutional barriers to inclusion. This specific concern was mentioned 14 times by 7 participants in response to questions about institutional guidance on supporting students with disabilities, the extent to which participants followed such guidance, and the extent to which they felt supported by their institution when teaching students with disabilities. Common features of these responses: participants perceived a lack of adequate communication with and support for teachers. There was also a perceived lack of meaningful accommodations for students and a lack of adequate knowledge or expertise in supporting teachers or students on the part of the university. So in other words, these teachers were saying, there's the support office at my university, but nobody there can help me. Nobody seems to know what they're doing. Nobody's helping me. No one's helping the students, right? They all felt that this was inadequate. Additionally, there's a concern that when such support is offered, when support for teachers teaching students with disabilities is offered by some center on campus, it is likely to only be in Japanese, which presents further barriers to or preventing non-Japanese teachers from accessing support. So some English language teachers, they encounter a language barrier, or they might even be discouraged. They might say, I'm not even going to bother asking because I don't think I can navigate the language barrier in getting the support that I need to help the student. When asked about his institution's guidance on supporting students with disabilities, just for a sort of representative comment, participant A responded, it's basically nothing. It's basically, they send you that request, and then it's up to the teachers. Like, everything's up to the teacher's discretion. So one of the frustrating things is if the student calls the office to ask for help, the office will say, please contact the teacher because it's up to the teacher, right? But here's the teacher not knowing what to do. So it's just this, like, endless loop of nobody knows how to support who, right? Or whom. So this concern was also frequently connected to a concern for Japanese cultural interference. Many participants attributed inadequate institutional support to cultural aspects of institutional organization and operation, and/or a deficit view of disability they perceived to be more common in Japan than in other, especially Western countries. And just to point out, this concern was not raised only by the foreign nationals, right? The Japanese teachers who were in this data set also voiced this concern. These teachers often said that they turned to finding support when they were doing independent research, for example. They found that research on inclusive teaching or research on learning difficulties was better in English compared to Japanese, for example. So this was a common concern across that nationality divide. Okay, so now this brings me to the sort of last set of data that I want to share, which relates to the IPELT results. So the first part of the qualitative data collection was these lesson observations. And I went into these lesson observations with this scale, the Inclusive Practices in English Language Teaching scale, which had 40 behaviors that I was looking for. Each of these 40 behaviors was magnitude coded on a score essentially from 0 to 3 based on how frequently it was observed. And so I want to share some of these results with you now. So after I had all of these magnitude scores for all of these different teachers, I could generate means, right? And so almost like a Likert scale, essentially. And so I'll show you all of them. We don't need to read through all 40 of these behaviors, clearly, but I want to just highlight a few things. First of all, at the very top, you can see toleration of learner error, right? Tolerating learner error is an inclusive practice. It's an inclusive behavior. This is the only inclusive behavior that had a perfect score, we could say, of 3, right? All 13 teachers that I observed were completely tolerant of learner error at every every stage of the lesson. This is unsurprising as language teachers, because making errors, making mistakes is part of the language learning process, and we understand that as language teachers. However, some of these other behaviors started to appear, a bit less frequently. And I'm going to kind of jump to the end. So here's the second group, sort of middle of these 40 behaviors. We can see, we don't need to look too closely at the behaviors, but we can just see the means going down. We're getting down, but still, even at the bottom of this table, we're above 2. So these behaviors are still on average being observed in most activities by most teachers, which is good. And then we get to the last slide here, and we're getting below the midpoint of 1.5. So these behaviors that are 1.5 or below, these are being observed, less than half of the time, sort of roughly speaking. And most of these behaviors are in 2 specific pedagogical domains: differentiation and specific consideration for students with disabilities. So without focusing too closely on the inclusive teaching behaviors themselves, we can shift our attention to the pedagogical domain to help us make a little bit more sense of this. Basically, this is telling us that these teachers, this group of teachers, and perhaps other language teachers, English language teachers, there are certain inclusive behaviors that they are performing very well, but there are other inclusive behaviors that they're not performing well. And so this can inform their training needs, right? What they can make up for, how they can close the gap in their inclusive teaching. So if these teachers were better equipped for doing differentiated instruction and making specific considerations for students with disabilities, then their teaching could be much more inclusive. And then to a lesser extent, these behaviors related to student development, classroom management, assessment, task organization, some of these other lower areas could certainly help improve their inclusive instruction as well. And interview data also helped identify training needs, right? So I can look at this data and make some conclusions, draw some conclusions about these teachers' training needs. But of course, I also asked the teachers, point blank, what do you think are your training needs? And then there were incidental mentions of these training needs elsewhere in the interview data. So when asked to identify their own training needs in relation to teaching with disabilities, 2 participants were unable to identify any specific needs. They basically said, I don't know, right? I don't know what I don't know, so I can't answer that. The other 11 participants had some idea about what they needed, and thematic analysis of responses revealed several needs that could be grouped into 2 general categories. These were increased knowledge and skills about teaching students with disabilities, and training on identifying students with disabilities in the classroom, which again, of course, connects to this context of, or this policy of selective inclusion. And I'll talk about each one of these now, because participants had a range of ideas about how to best meet these needs, which were occasionally linked to specific forms of disability, contextual factors, and inclusive behaviors. So first, I will talk briefly about this need for increased knowledge and skills about teaching students with disabilities. 9 of the 13 participants expressed this need, though there were different ways in which these participants preferred to fulfill it. One participant said that they like written case studies along with a clear set of principles to create inclusivity. Another said training on how to best teach and manage students experiencing poor mental health and students with ADHD. Another said a 3-day workshop on inclusive practices and the latest research on teaching students with disabilities. Great recommendation. I don't know why specifically 3 days. Seems like a very, kind of targeted number, but that was their suggestion. Another said more materials on the student perspective, very valuable, of course. More information about on-campus services and provisions for support. Also, one big theme that came out of this was the importance of collaboration. 4 participants expressed the need for more frequent and formalized collaboration as a means of overcoming their own lack of inclusive knowledge and skills. 2 of these 4 wanted to share best practices in the form of regular teachers' meetings or lesson observations with colleagues. The other 2 wanted to collaborate with experts from other fields, for example, talking to, a psychology professor in their university to help them benchmark and get some new best practices. All of which ideas. And other researchers have made the same suggestion, have found the same collaboration with other teachers and outside experts as a means of ongoing professional development can help satisfy this need for more inclusive training and knowledge among ELTs. This has been demonstrated before. And so as a quick aside here, this presentation tonight is a research report, right? I'm reporting on the research that I conducted and the findings that I found. But if you came to this presentation hoping to get like practical takeaways for classroom instruction, I'm sorry that this is more focused on research, but this is one practical takeaway that you can take from this research, right? This is something that you can start doing tomorrow, right? You can collaborate. You can email the person next door in your office, an old teaching friend, whoever. Collaborate with other teachers, find other people outside of your field who you think might be able to inform your instruction. This is something that you can take away and start acting on right now. Collaboration is really, really, really helpful for improving your own capacity for teaching inclusively. Okay. Another training need that was reported by three participants wish to know more about how to identify students with disabilities enrolled in their classes. One participant thought he could benefit from a sensitive framework for discerning potential disabilities in the classroom. Another wanted the ability to tell the difference between like what's bad behavior and what's something to do with a disability. This need is likely unique to teaching contexts with a policy of selective inclusion. So these instances where we might suspect there's a student in our classroom that has a disability, but they haven't disclosed it or it hasn't been diagnosed. Okay, so we're getting close to the end now, doing great on time. So I'm going to give a summary of these main findings, talk about the implications and limitations, and then we'll sort of open this up for some discussion. So first of all, as we saw from the quantitative findings from the survey results, English language teachers have generally positive views of teaching students with disabilities, and these teachers' views are most heavily influenced by training to teach such students, whether it be pre-service or in-service training. Common concerns in the present set related to diagnosis and disclosure of students with disabilities and curricular constraints, both of which were frequently connected to institutional barriers to inclusion, cultural interference. Many English language teachers are already implementing inclusive practices, as we saw from those IPELT results, right? A lot of those things that those teachers were doing were inclusive, even if these teachers were not aware that they were being inclusive, right? They're being accidentally inclusive, or if they're not trained, right? If they don't have formal training, they've still found a way to sort of compensate and be good inclusive teachers. However, there's still a lot that can be done, right? No teacher's instruction was perfectly inclusive, so to speak. Specifically, in regards to differentiation and specific consideration for students with disabilities. So more can be done in these areas by teachers, teacher trainers, and other stakeholders, for example, university leadership. Pre-service programs need more robust training in inclusive practices for ELTs. More targeted in-service training should be offered as ongoing professional development, especially in regards to differentiation and specific consideration for students with disabilities, as well as identifying possible students with disabilities. To a lesser extent, inclusive skills and knowledge related to student development, classroom management, and assessment would also likely benefit English language teachers and their students. English language teachers and their students can benefit from more structured and systematic institutional support, opportunities for formalized collaboration, again, and in-service training on inclusive practices. Language program administrators and university leadership should also offer more support for English language teachers with students with disabilities enrolled in their classes. Again, because so many teachers were telling me that they weren't getting support that they needed from their institution. And then above all else, a paradigm shift towards greater inclusivity must be realized across the TESOL field. I do really firmly believe that this shift is happening already. It's been happening, it's in progress, but we can do more to move it along more quickly. There's things we can do in the classroom and outside of the classroom and off of our campuses, right? Outside of our schools. We can teach more inclusively. We can talk to more people about it. We can push for more presentations and talks at conferences and things like this. We can push for more pre-service training. If any of you in the audience are in a position, to get a course in an MA-TESOL program, right, there's a lot more that can be done to help usher this paradigm shift. All of that said, there are some key limitations that we have to consider when we think about these results. First of all, when attempting to measure inclusive education, there is a high likelihood of encountering a lack of contextual sensitivity in measurement instruments, no matter what the method or criteria chosen. And that's certainly true of the instruments that I used. And so I think replication would help to overcome this and lend more confidence to the findings. Additionally, convenient sampling allowed for sampling bias, selection bias, and positivity bias. And so these findings may not be generalizable beyond the participants that responded to the survey. Also, the sample size was kind of small, 239, and reduction of observable variables in the concerned subscale during the confirmatory factor analysis may have resulted in overfitting the model. And so again, replication, ideally with a larger set of teachers, would be very helpful here. Finally, finally for this slide, reliability of self-reporting on the SASI-AR has been questioned before, as some teachers may be unwilling to report beliefs that could be considered negative. So if I'm putting a survey in front of teachers that says, what do you think about people with disabilities, essentially? A lot of people will have a sort of internal filter, even though it's anonymous, they might not answer that some of these items really truthfully. They might score themselves up a little bit. Additionally, regarding the qualitative data collection, some of the behaviors on the IPELT were not fully qualified through both observation and participant self-reporting in the interviews. These magnitude code scores of 0 to 3. Some of these scores I made based purely on my observation. Some of them I made purely based on information from the interview because these behaviors were not directly observable. Other behaviors were sort of triangulated based on what I observed and what I interviewed. And so this, can call some of these rankings of these mean scores into question. Additionally, I was the only rater conducting these observations. And so this allows for more bias in the interpretation of critical incidents and increases the possibility of rater drift and magnitude coding. If there had been a second or third observer and we are all sort of giving our own magnitude scores and then averaging all of those, we would have a more reliable results. Finally, and critically, rendering any definition of inclusive education into actual practice is value-laden and subjective. The IPELT and the assessments of participants' ability to perform these behaviors, these 40 behaviors, is based on my subjective notion of inclusion and best inclusive practices. Sure, I conducted a very thorough literature review. This is my sort of special research area. But at the end of the day, I am still making subjective judgments about what items to include on this scale as being best inclusive practices and whether or not teachers were fulfilling them properly. Another person who's just as knowledgeable about this topic as I am might come up with a different set of 40 inclusive behaviors and might rate them differently for the same observed lesson. So there's some subjectivity involved that has to be acknowledged. Okay, now, finally, I did promise that I would try to connect these findings back to these sort of worldwide or sort of global patterns of implementing inclusive education. And so I'll try to do that now. So the definition that I shared at the beginning was from this United Nations document, right? The General Comment 4 to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That same policy document in 2016 identified 8 complicating factors that perpetuate barriers to the realization of inclusive education worldwide. And this was from, the committee's very thorough research review. And I won't go through all 3. I've highlighted the 3 that I think are exemplified by this research and my own experience collecting data. And I point them out because I think that these are things that we can help to overcome by engaging in inclusive education, both in practice and in research. And so the first of these, C, is a lack of knowledge about the nature and advantages of inclusive and quality education. E is a lack of disaggregated data and research necessary for accountability and program development, which impedes the development of effective policies and interventions to promote inclusive and quality education, specifically at the meso level, right, at the university level. These university policies and interventions to promote inclusivity seem to be lacking. And then finally, a lack of political will. technical knowledge and capacity in implementing the right to inclusive education, including insufficient education for all teaching staff, right? This is something else that seemed to bear out in the data. So my findings, I believe, demonstrate and support or demonstrate these specific complicating factors. They support this committee's, review of our identification of these factors, and they also kind of help us maybe direct some of our efforts. So if you are in the audience and you're doing inclusive education research, if you're trying to teach more inclusively, or you're trying to create a more inclusive institutional ethos in your own teaching context, I think these are things that we can, these considerations can help us focus our efforts so that we can try to overcome this lack of political will. We can try and overcome this lack of disaggregated data, and we can try and overcome this lack of knowledge about and the nature of advantages of inclusive and quality education, right? We can do that through improving our own teaching practices. We can do that by talking with our colleagues about the need to teach more inclusively. We can do this by contacting the Students with Disabilities Support Office at our own university, contacting our chair or our dean, and pushing for this kind of reform. We can overcome this by doing action research or other sort of research focused on inclusivity in our own. So that brings me to the end. Very quickly, all of the data that I shared for you today has been published and is available. And so if you want to kind of drill down more into any of these findings, they've all been reported in these 3 papers. The 2 papers on the left and right are open access, and the paper in the middle is from a JOLT proceedings that was published over the summer from last year's JOLT annual conference. And so if you're a JOLT member, you'll have access to that too. And so I encourage you to, peruse any of these papers as you like, and you'll also find the full list of references in one or more of those papers. How am I on time? Oh, okay, a little long, sorry. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Open any questions?